Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation, the show dedicated to discussing the differences between films and the books they were based on. So, do any of you guys remember a bloke called Alfred Hitchcock? Yeah, that guy. Well, he did a thing based on a thing. But before he did that thing, he did a thing based on a thing by the same author. That's the thing we're going to look at today. I feel behooved to make a bigger deal out of the spoiler warning than usual on this occasion because my main lingering impression of this book is that it relies very heavily on plot twists for its appeal. Personally, I found everything that wasn't centered around these twists a bit hard to get through, so I wouldn't be inclined to recommend it to someone who's already aware of them. Also, to avoid confusion, I'm just going to mention now that one particular non-change between this book and film is them never revealing the name of the young protagonist. There's several theories as to why this is, including the possibility that the author wanted to imply that she was so overshadowed by the woman who the story is named after, she wasn't even given a full sense of her own identity. Personally, I have no fucking idea, but I just wanted to forewarn you as to why I'll be referring to her as the narrator or the lead throughout this. Because this appears to be one of the relatively less universally watched movies I've covered, I feel inclined to provide a plot synopsis of the film before we start, so everyone who's not seen it will know the significance of the changes. If you have seen it, please feel free to skip ahead. Here is your time code. For everyone else, a young woman in her early 20s is working as a professional companion, which apparently is a cross between a maid, a secretary, and a pretend friend, for a rather obnoxious American woman by the name of Van Hopper. While on holiday in France, they happen to end up in the same hotel as a man named Maxim de Winter, who had featured in the papers about a year ago because his wife had tragically drowned when her boat capsized just offshore from their seaside estate in the south coast of Britain. Her name was Rebecca, and by all accounts, they had truly worshipped each other. De Winter is subtly rude to Van Hopper, but takes a liking to her young companion, so they start spending time together whenever Mrs. Van Hopper wasn't around. He claims to be enjoying spending time with her, but doesn't show it very well, and can easily fall into a detached melancholy if something reminds him of his late wife. Regardless, she ends up falling hopelessly in love with him, and is most upset when her employer decides they will be leaving soon. When she goes to say goodbye to De Winter, he, in a rather matter-of-fact and unromantic way, proposes marriage. She accepts and bids farewell to her former employer, getting married within the week. After a long honeymoon, they head back to his estate in England, a place named Manderley, famous for its stunning beauty and rich history. However, upon arrival, things start to go downhill. The housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, is a very intimidating woman and seems to take an instant dislike to the lead. There's also a universal, continuous expectation from everyone that she will instantly assume the role of Rebecca, following the same daily activities she enjoyed and making all the same decisions. The lead feels increasingly overshadowed by the memory of someone who seems to have been too perfect to be true, a confident, beautiful, intelligent woman beloved by all. It's really not helped by her extremely timid nature and tendency to allow everyone to treat her as a doormat. All anyone has to do is mention that the late Mrs. De Winter would have done something a certain way, and she instantly concedes and agrees that would be best. Maxim's sister warns the lead that Mrs. Danvers was very fond of Rebecca, partially explaining her hostility towards her. Convinced now that she is little more than a rebound distraction for Maxim, she slowly falls into a deep depression. While out for a walk with their pet dog, he runs off to a hitherto unexplored nearby beachfront. Maxim refuses to go after him, but she follows and discovers a strange cottage right on the beach that looks like it was decorated to be a lavish home, but appears to have been abandoned for a while. Upon returning, she finds Maxim in a foul mood and discovers that that was the beachfront that Rebecca had drowned on. The lead's timid nature continues to the point where she accidentally breaks an ornament and ends up hiding it like a guilty child instead of telling anyone, and her losing yet more respect from everyone in the house when she finally comes clean. Maxim has to go away for a few days, and while he's gone, Rebecca's cousin, a rather sleazy man by the name of Favel, turns up to visit Mrs. Danvers. He introduces himself to the lead, then slouches off with a request that she not tell her husband about his visit. Until this point, the lead has been resisting the urge to go into Rebecca's former room, but finally gives in. She finds Mrs. Danvers inside and discovers that the old lady is dancing just a little too close to the line between sanity and insanity and has the crap scared out of her. Maxim gets talked into throwing a fancy dress party at Manderley, something that used to be a yearly tradition. The lead, determined to think of a surprising costume, costume has her attention drawn to a famous painting of one of Maxim's ancestors by Mrs. Danvers, who suggests that if she can have the dress made, it would make an excellent costume.
It's a trap!
On the day of the party, it's revealed that this is exactly what Rebecca did for the last party before her death. Maxim is understandably shocked and furious. The lead confronts Mrs. Danvers for setting her up, but she shows no regrets, saying the lead had no right to try to replace her beloved Rebecca. She takes advantage of the lead's emotionally drained state to try to talk her into committing suicide, but just in time, the sound of a huge shipwreck not far away snaps her out of it. While the Coast Guard is assessing the damage, a diver discovers the wreck of Rebecca's old boat and finds a body inside. This is a surprise to all, as Maxim identified a body washed up on the shore about a year before as Rebecca. This new development forces local law enforcement to reopen the investigation into her death. Maxim seems to despair over this, and when questioned by the lead, reveals a lot of things that she was not expecting, including the fact that Rebecca was not in fact a wonderful person like everyone said, but actually a cruel-minded serial adulterer and manipulator. After years of being mentally abused by her, they got into an argument in the cottage by the sea, which she regularly used to shag her extramarital lovers. She revealed she was pregnant with another man's child and then tripped over and hit her head, killing herself. He suspects he might have struck her, but isn't sure because it's all a blur. Terrified that people would assume murder and not wanting to tarnish Manderley's reputation, Maxim dragged her body out to the boat she liked to sail and sank it slightly out to sea. The lead, convinced that none of this was his fault, immediately commits herself to helping him escape any sort of punishment for this. Things go quite well considering. The court at first suspects that De Winter made a simple mistake with identifying the other body, then, even when a shipwright explains that the boat was intentionally scuttled, they decide it was probably suicide, as the pretend happiness between Maxim and Rebecca that he hated so much was dispositioning people away from the idea that he could have wanted her dead. Unfortunately for them, Favell turns up with a note from Rebecca that suggests she did not intend suicide and attempts to blackmail De Winter with it. Refusing to be pushed around, Maxim doubles down on his bluff and has the local magistrate take a look at it. After a short investigation, they discover that Rebecca saw a doctor the day she died. Convinced that this doctor would reveal that she was pregnant and give a motive for murder, Maxim despairs, but is too stubborn and proud to stop now, so leads a party to go visit him. Shockingly, the doctor reveals that Rebecca was not pregnant, but dying of cancer, meaning she probably did commit suicide, just not in the way that everyone thought. Returning home, having apparently gotten away with it scot-free, De Winter discovers that Mrs. Danvers has taken it upon herself to punish him after all, and burn down Manderley, choosing to stay inside and join Rebecca. Fortunately, it seems at least no one else was hurt but her. The end. Okay, now here's my quick review of the book just as a book. Just a warning, a lot of my comments here are more subjective than usual. Take them with a pinch of salt if our opinions have differed in the past. In the build-up to this, every time I mentioned to someone that I was reading Rebecca, the first thing they always said was, "Oh, Daphne du Maurier." In addition, most editions of the book show the author's name much larger than the title. As you would expect from this, Miss du Maurier was one of those novelists who received enough recognition for multiple works that her reputation is considered the most likely thing to affect individual book sales. These days, part of that reputation comes from association to Hitchcock, but she was a pretty big deal long before he touched any of her stories. I confess I have not read any of her other books but this one, so I don't know if its strengths and weaknesses are indicative of her overall skills, so please consider this a review of this particular book and not her whole career. As I mentioned in my warning, I personally found the parts of this book that were not centered around the big reveals or plot twists to be a bit of a chore to get through. The first 2/3 was basically a long description of the day-to-day social engagements of a very rich but very dysfunctional married couple, mixed in with the timid meanderings of a young woman with a chronic case of no backbone-itis. If you're into that sort of thing, fine, but my preference towards female book characters tends to lean more towards the fearless space captain variety, so I found the narrator of this book a bit tiresome. Du Maurier really did love her descriptive metaphors and similes, good lord she did. It seems like everything in this book was like something else. At one point she describes the smell of the library as being like a church where sermons are seldom ever held. Now, don't get me wrong, I get that she meant musky, but she could have just said musky. And the narrator has such specific fantasies all the time. If she's imagining what their future kids would be doing, she would predict how many of them there are, what age they would be, their genders, the way they would walk, exactly what they would leave on the coffee table and what she would say about it. And if she was picturing the things that Maxim used to do with Rebecca, as she often did, she thought she knew exactly where they were sitting, what they did, what they said, exactly what expressions they pulled. Even in the book they acknowledge that this gets a little freaky. Maxim tells her at one point that she was so caught up in her imaginings, she had acted out her fantasy over breakfast, expressions and all. This is gonna sound like the weirdest complaint in the world, especially coming from me, but Holy damn, this book is just too British! Are you sure you won't take some more tea, darling? Fifth really has outdone himself with the crumpets and buttered scones today, don't you think? Yes, dear. Good lord, Gloucestershire lost by 17 wickets. Who the devil taught these vagabonds how to play cricket? I've half a mind to go down there and teach them a thing or two. Oh, before I forget, Colonel Julian and the vicar's wife are coming for afternoon tea tomorrow, and I thought it might be a good time to discuss the— would you tone it down just a little? Good lord, I feel like I'm about to pass St. George's Cross out through my urethra like a kidney stone. I say, routines were brought up an awful lot in this book. This became our routine. That was her routine. We had interrupted his routine. Apparently doing exactly the same shit every day was much more desirable back in the 1930s. I didn't particularly like that the book just suddenly ends without tying the main story into the prologue. It's quite jarring, and it forces you to guess a lot about what happened immediately afterwards without much evidence to go on. I'm told some of the more expensive versions of the book have an unpublished epilogue that does wrap things up a little better, but as mine didn't have it, and it seems it was cut out intentionally by the author, we have to conclude that it's definitely non-canonical. Seeing as most of what I just did was complain about it, I probably should say that I do acknowledge that this is a very good book that's very skillfully written, and very deserving of the recognition it's received. It's just that none of those things are a guarantee that I'm going to enjoy it. Let's talk film. Well, it's a Hitchcock movie, isn't it? Dude had mad game, bro. Mad game. I don't know why I'm saying that, I'm sorry. What I mean is, there's a reason that Hitchcock is a legend amongst filmmakers. He was creative, innovative, ahead of his time, yet skilled in the traditional ways of filmmaking, a master of suspense and misdirection. Apparently a mean-spirited sexist wanker in person, but I've learnt the Orson Scott Card way that it's important to at least try not to judge the art by the artist. So yeah, the movie's good. That's basically what I'm trying to get across here. I really liked all of the cast, Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine in particular, but strong choices throughout. I'm given to understand there were some issues regarding some people having to turn down the role for the female lead in order to give other people a chance at it, but I'm happy the chips landed the way they did. I think one of the main reasons that Rebecca isn't more widely known is because for a Hitchcock du Maurier team-up, it kind of got overshadowed by the birds, which is a shame, but is understandable. Let's discuss the adaptation. Amusingly, it's reported that Hitchcock had initially planned to treat the book as only the vaguest of guidelines, but producer David Selznick went to bat for the novel, insisting the film be re-scripted to follow the original story. Evidently, he was successful. Rebecca follows the plot of the book of the same name very loyally, with only a few exceptions. Very interesting exceptions, but before we can talk about those, the film stuck to almost all of what I would consider the essential points of the story. The chance meeting in the hotel, the story of Rebecca's death, the matter-of-fact proposal, intimidating Mrs. Danvers, the lead's hopeless lack of backbone that led her to doing things like hiding from guests in her own house, the discovery that Mrs. Danvers was most definitely batshit crazy, the lead letting herself get tricked by her into dressing up as Rebecca, then trying to get her to kill herself, the ship that ran ashore, the discovery of Rebecca's sunken boat, the revelation that Rebecca actually kinda sucked in real life, the trial that concluded suicide, and Favell trying to get to the truth but discovering it wasn't what he expected. Actually, damn near everything I mentioned in the film synopsis is true to the book. You could say that numerically there's virtually nothing they changed, but trust me, the small amount they did was pretty significant. Haha! More vague foreshadowing. The film made the rather ballsy choice to keep true to the book's portrayal of Rebecca as this larger-than-life phantom character and didn't cast an actress to play her, even for the flashbacks, electing to explain them verbally instead. This might have fallen afoul of the show-don't-tell rule of cinema, but Hitchcock was smart enough to know that if he was going to film a scene of someone just standing there telling a story, he was going to have to get creative with it. A slow panning shot across the room, touching on the spots mentioned in the story may not seem like much, but it was surprisingly effective. A small but particularly nice touch was the main title of the film being in Rebecca's flowing handwriting. The opening narration is word for word from the opening of the book, setting the tone for the entire movie, as, even though it's not all of it, a lot of the dialogue is very book loyal. The setting for said narration, i.e. an undetermined time in the future after Manderley was destroyed and abandoned, is accurate to the book, though I may have to touch upon this again later. The film chose a really good spot to film Manderley, though not to brag, but beautiful 100-year-old estates aren't actually that hard to find in England, though admittedly most of them are being converted into golf courses or amusement parks now. I'm not even kidding, Google Alton Towers. Loud and obnoxious Mrs. Van Hopper is a good likeness to her book counterpart. It's been pointed out to me that despite her unpopularity, we could all stand to learn a little from her when it comes to self-confidence.
I remember when I was younger, there was a well-known writer who used to dart down the back way whenever he saw me coming. I suppose he was in love with me and wasn't quite sure of himself. Well, c'est la vie.
The lead's wish for a memory bottling device so she could relive the happiness she was feeling getting to know Maxim, along with Maxim's rather downer response to that. In both the book and the film, Maxim suddenly rather curtly orders the lead to stop biting her nails, and I had a 50 Shades of Grey flashback and trashed half my house. The lead's subsequent wish that she could be 36 years old and dressed in black satin, so Maxim would have more respect for her. Maxim's sister Beatrice, with her good intentions but no brain-to-mouth filter, is pretty good in her one appearance in the film. She pops up quite a few times in the book, but never really does anything for the plot aside from provide the occasional exposition, so whatever. Ben, the local mentally handicapped man who had to testify, is in the book. It's hinted at that he's not quite as unaware of the goings-on around him as he makes out, suggesting he might be helping to cover up for Maxim because the narrator was kind to him in a way that Rebecca most certainly wasn't. The "we're happy, aren't we, darling, if you say so, dear" conversation is another book original. For reasons I'll explain later, it fits better in the book though. The rather gross revelation that Rebecca had been doing her own cousin, which I guess must have been legal in Britain back then because I'm pretty damn sure it isn't now. Okay, so I know law enforcement probably worked a little differently back then, but I can't be the only one who thinks it's a little insane that, in both the book and the film, the investigation to determine if a murder took place was being headed up by the deceased's incestuous lover and the man accused of said murder. I can't really imagine a situation with more conflicts of interest involved. And finally, the rather abrupt ending to the story with Manderley in flames is in the book, and it's actually even more abrupt there as they literally just arrive, see that it's on fire, and boom! Book's done. Right, time to finally talk about those changes. I hope I didn't foreshadow them too much and set them up for a letdown. Oh well. Despite being loyal to the story as a whole, the film is guilty of adding an additional layer of drama to a lot of individual scenes. The lead and De Winter's first meeting was originally when Mrs. Van Hopper ambushed him with coffee in the hotel foyer, but the film added in her interrupting a possible suicide attempt at the top of the cliffs before that. They then extended her almost leaving with Mrs. Van Hopper without getting a chance to see him well past the point it got to in the books, with them missing each other's calls and getting into the loaded car before she decided to run back to him. Then at the hearing, the lead's well-timed fainting that reminded Maxim that he needed to keep his calm is even more well-timed, as they make it very clear that he was about to lose his shit completely and blurt out the entire story. Unusually for me, I feel inclined to forgive the film for these things, as they're largely harmless to the plot, and in this case, it really didn't hurt to add a bit more excitement here and there. A very prominent change is the lead finding her courage before she finds out the truth about Rebecca. In the book, the revelation that Rebecca was not so wonderful in reality is what changed everything for the lead. It's the turning point of the whole story, including her growing a damn backbone. It's like the shade of her predecessor had been choking her all the way through the story, but had finally been banished. Maxim sees the change too. He mourns the loss of the naive, young, innocent girl he fell in love with, but she enjoys her newfound courage and determination, and honestly, I'm inclined to say screw you, Maxim, you bloody cradle snatcher. Of all the changes in this film, this disconnecting of the lead's turnaround from the truth about Rebecca is the only one I can't for the life of me figure out a reason for. Despite that, it still pales in comparison to the next one, which is by far the biggest change of the whole film. While the film comes up with some convoluted tale of how Rebecca had slipped on some fishing line and bashed her head, a tragic accident that Maxim had covered up out of panic that no one would believe he was not responsible, the book made it much simpler. Maxim de Winter, finally pushed too far by his adulterous wife's taunts that she was pregnant with another man's child but he was going to have to raise it to avoid a scandal, pulls out a gun and shoots her dead in cold-blooded murder. Azkaban. Wait, am I still doing this? Terence, are we still doing the Azkaban bit? The cause of this change might have been mistaken for a decision to make Maxim less of a bastard and therefore more sympathetic to the audience. However, the truth may be a bit more political than that. You see, back in 1940, when Rebecca was being adapted into film, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, an organization that would later rename itself the Motion Picture Association of America, was enforcing something called the Motion Picture Production Code. Basically, it was a set of rules about what you were or were not allowed to show in an American film for ethical or moral reasons. Or at least that was the party line. What it usually boiled down to was censoring anything that might upset a conservative old white man. High on the list was the surprisingly specific rule that a film cannot show someone killing their spouse and getting away with it. If Hitchcock wanted the film to see a wide release, he had to change this bit of the story. What's actually very amusing is how little he had to change the rest of the story around it. Du Maurier most certainly does not start treating Maxim as a villain from this point on. It's almost like she expected all of her readers to agree that he was completely justified in murdering Rebecca. What's especially weird is the narrator's reaction to discovering what he did, because, believe it or not, I think she was actually more upset to find out about the accident in the film. Oh, my darling, I love you so much, but you have to know the truth. I killed Rebecca. I shot her through the chest and carried her to her boat. I sailed it out to sea and scuttled it to hide my terrible crime, and I've been dreading the day that she would return from beyond the grave to ruin me once more. I'm so sorry I dragged you into the sordid mess that is my life. So, you really love me? Well, yes, but I'm also saying I'm a killer. Maxim, all I've ever wanted to hear you say is that you love me. I shot my last wife, darling. I pulled out a gun and put a bullet in a defenseless woman. You care for me in a way you never even cared for Rebecca. There was blood everywhere. I kept having to go back for more buckets of seawater to clean the cottage with. Oh, Maxim, you've made me so happy. I love you too. I should not be the one freaked out by this conversation. Yeah, her priorities seem pretty messed up to me. I mean, even if she didn't give a shit about Rebecca's death, I'm really not sure she's fully thinking through the implications of this. The power dynamic in their relationship was already pretty one-sided, but can you imagine what it'd be like being married to someone who's proven he'd take murder over a messy divorce once already? Darling, you said you'd be the one to take Jasper for a walk today. I've done it every day this week. This really is unfair. You know what? I could probably use the exercise. Come along, Jasper! There's so much more I could say on the subject of his itchy trigger finger, but even if we were to ignore that rather extreme story alteration, Maxim is still by far the single most changed thing in this entire film. And that's mostly because film Maxim is not a total wanker. Delving once again into the realms of the subjective, I found book Maxim utterly devoid of any kind of charm and can only assume was appealing to the narrator because of some side effect of her extreme youthful naivete. Daddy issues. Mrs. De Winter, Mr. De Winter is on the telephone. He said to say he's arrived safely in London. Oh, thank you, Thrift. Oh, no, he doesn't want to speak to you. In fact, the message wasn't even for you, it was for Mr. Crawley. I just, thought you'd want to know. Oh. I'm undecided if this was intentional on the part of the author, a failing on her part to imbue the character with any likability, or if Book Maxim is just one of those characters that I simply don't get the appeal of, but apparently holds some for certain demographics. While some of this is carried over into the film, there's a constant improvement in Maxim's behaviour and overall charm throughout. Some of this is due to Olivier's natural charisma, bringing with his easy smile and friendly demeanour some much needed magnetism to the character. Not all though, as his actions are subtly changed as well. His interactions with the lead are generally warmer and less gruff and patronising, even after they return to Manderley. He gets mad at her a lot less in the film, and when he does, he calms down a lot sooner and apologises for being so unnecessarily hostile. He also seems to be making a genuine effort every now and again, buying her flowers on their wedding day to try and make it at least a little romantic, and doing things to endear the staff at Manderley to her, like giving them all bonuses to celebrate her arrival. Book Maxim did none of these things. He'd already been through the big wedding thing once, and didn't seem to care that his new bride had not, and he left it entirely up to her to win over the staff at his home. Now this is inescapably an adaptation fail, and even though it made him a much more endearing character, thus investing the audience more in his well-being when he's in danger at the end, it's also a two-edged sword from a film perspective. With Maxim remaining more affectionate towards the lead on their return to Manderley, it reduces the contrast between before and after he admits he never loved Rebecca. That was what finally removed the barrier keeping him from showing his love for her. I really can't stress enough just how much of a game changer that was in the book. The film seriously nerfed that moment, and I think it suffered for that. There's some mention in the film of the lead's father painting the same tree over and over again before his death that I don't remember being in the book. The moment where she gets caught sketching Maxim like a besotted schoolgirl is also just in the film. In the book, Favell blows most of his chances to be taken seriously by being consistently half drunk when he made all his accusations. The narrator realises that Maxim's colleague and best friend Frank had figured out the truth early on in the book, but it's never openly acknowledged like it is at the end of the film. I guess not murderer Maxim was more willing to verbalise the events for obvious reasons. The narrator was present in the book when the team went to see the Doctor for the penultimate plot twist, but was left behind in the film. A bit mean, but I guess as she's no longer the point of view for the audience, she was no longer needed for that scene. The ending of the film takes another dive into the realms of the more dramatic. In the book, it's hinted strongly that Mrs. Danvers lit the fire that destroyed Manderley, as she reportedly received a call, probably Favell telling her that Maxim had escaped justice, then disappeared just before the fire started. However, it's never confirmed, and it's mentioned in the prologue that no one knows what happened to her in the end. Hitchcock apparently decided it would be much more exciting if it was clear that she was the arsonist, and she chose to stay and dramatically die in the fire. Though I should mention that's not the only possible reason for them writing in Mrs. Danvers' horrific death in the film. It could also have been to punish her for being a naughty lesbian. Usually I wouldn't bring this up in the main review, but it's actually quite relevant to the adaptation this time. You see, in the book it's entirely possible to get a lesbian vibe from Mrs. Danvers at first because of the way she always talks so wishfully about Rebecca, and because everyone's always going on and on about how much she adored Rebecca and was so very, very fond of Rebecca. However, that's quashed when they get to the confrontation after the costume party, when she rants and raves about how she basically raised Rebecca. She'd been her governess and maid since she was a small child and had been with her ever since. She was effectively her mother, and her feelings towards her were made clear to be purely maternal. The film skipped over that part, so you're left with a woman who does nothing but talk about how beautiful she was and who kept all her underwear so she can run her hands over it occasionally. It's not hard to see why this is viewed as being part of Hollywood's old habit of demonizing homosexuals. How intentional and or morally bankrupt this is above my pay grade, but as I said, it's not in the book. I thought for just a second that Hitchcock was going even further with Mrs. Danvers' crime, as you see her approaching the sleeping Mrs. De Winter, and I was worried he had decided to add another murder to the story. Fortunately though, it seems she woke her up and gave everyone a chance to escape the mansion. I guess that means she actually still has the moral high ground on Maxim. Huh. So yeah, compared to a lot of adaptations, very few changes, but as I've said in the past, that can sometimes make the changes you do make stand out even more. Anyway, let's see what they cut out altogether. This is quite a tricky section because there's quite a lot cut out, but not a lot worth talking about. This film is a splendid example of how you can streamline a book-length story to film-length without having to sacrifice anything essential. Every scene has just a bit shaved off it to make the whole thing flow better, and Hitchcock also left out a lot of, well, for want of a better description, the scenes between scenes. Every time something happened in the book, there was a description of the time afterwards where everything settled down again before the next thing happened. For example, after Mrs. Danvers tricks the lead into wearing the same outfit as Rebecca at the party, it's not until the next day that she confronts her about it. There's a very long, very detailed description of the entire party and most of the next day, which really contributes very little to the actual plot. One arguable downside of this is he also streamlined the build-up to all of the plot twists. Everything has such a build-up in the book. I mean, obviously the big stuff like the murder confession, but also the smaller things, like the time between when Favel shows De Winter Rebecca's note and when De Winter insists the authorities have a look at it. In the film, it's about 30 seconds, just enough time for them to change rooms. In the book, it's several pages of the narrator freaking out internally and thinking of all the possible outcomes. When they're going to see the doctor at the end, there's a brief shot of them driving in a car. In the book, that's an entire chapter describing their journey, including stopping for lunch, what they ate, getting lost, and asking for directions. And what the directions were. To me, this made the book drag a lot in places, but I cannot deny it did make the final payoff very effective. The film misses out on this somewhat. I'm not saying its plot twists were devoid of surprise, it's just their effect was lessened somewhat by the shorter build-up. It's a trade-off. So, besides that, the larger omissions that are worthy of mention are, after the description of the dream of post-devastation Manderley, the start of the book also describes the life the narrator and Maxim are leading an unknown number of years after the main story. Apparently, they live in various expensive hotels and go through a quiet daily routine, avoiding publicity and the majority of the public. It appears Maxim is suffering from something that's causing his memory to go, and he sometimes seems panicky about where he is and what he's doing. It also seems that any reminder of Manderley or Rebecca would send him over the edge, and his wife would often need to distract him with boring but regular everyday things like cricket results to calm him. I don't really have any idea what this is meant to be. I mean, it could be some sort of post-traumatic stress disorder, or depending on how further in the future this is, some sort of early onset dementia. The novel makes a big deal out of a book of poems the narrator finds in Maxim's car when they were bonding in France. She finds a message from Rebecca to Max in the front. It's sort of an early symbol of Rebecca's influence over her, as she realizes that he's only ever asked her to call him Maxim, and believes there's a next level of intimacy she's yet to reach. While Maxim is explaining things to Mrs. Van Hopper, a conversation it's worth noting the narrator was too much of a coward to take part in the book, she tears out the page and symbolically burns it, already terrified of Rebecca's memory. The extensive and oh so detailed fantasies the narrator constantly immersed herself in that I mentioned in my book review are absent in the film, and thank goodness for that. The Dom's final thoughts. If it weren't for the major change forced upon them by the film production code, I would say that this film was the perfect example of how to compromise between staying loyal to the book and streamlining the story to better suit a film. Mr. Selznick acting as the book's champion to such great effect has got me thinking about that post that was making its way around the internet a little while ago. Maybe this really should be a thing. If you were to demand an opinion from me as to which I enjoyed more, I wouldn't hesitate to pick the film. But if someone were to tell me that they preferred the book or found them both equally enjoyable, I wouldn't be surprised at all. It pretty much comes down to personal preference on this one. The book deals in extremes. The slow bits are really slow and the plot twists are really surprising. As I've said a few times now, the impression it gave me was that it was relying very heavily on those plot twists to be appealing. But there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. If that's the kind of thing you like, then yeah, you'd love this book. In comparison, the film is just generally good throughout. It sacrificed some tension in exchange for a faster pace, and I personally think it found a better balance between the two. That said, because neither was massively life-changing for me, I suspect I may end up remembering the book for longer. A story that frustrates you as much as it entertains you does tend to stay in your memory more effectively. Anyway, getting back to the adaptation conclusion, again, with the exception of the change that was forced on them, I think they did a damn fine job of it. Hitchcock and Selznick, new dream team. Hey beautiful watchers, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder that there's a variety of rewards you can earn by becoming a Patreon, including early access to all videos, getting to be a part of the survey about how many people saw the film and read the book, or playing Minecraft with me on my 24-hour server. Higher level contributors can also join the Dom's Skype chat room, and best of all, choose future episodes of Lost in Adaptation. However, if right now you are thinking, my goodness the Dom, I can't do that, all of my funds are being put towards raising an army to defeat my house's ancient rival and avenge my father. Fear not, if you would instead be willing to like, share, subscribe, or a combination of all three, that goes a long way towards helping my channel grow and reach new beautiful watchers. Have a most pleasant day, and I will see you soon.